wait for another second for everyone to settle down. And thank you all of you first for coming, because I know it's like a little bit of a trek. Jumping over all those sand piles and cement piles and negotiating all the rubbish on the road coming in, because we've had to go through this for the last couple of months. But hopefully it's going to be much better, and it will come to an end soon. So thank you. I know there are lots of fun things happening this evening in the city, so it's nice to see a fairly full house. Mayank is, of course, an old friend, and I have been very, I think impressed is the kind of wrong word, but very moved by his commitment to Indian textiles and to his ideas, and so he's teaching for our diploma course, and we invite those who teach at the course to give a public lecture as well, and I'm so happy that you accepted and that he's going to share his ideas and his vision and his knowledge of Indian textiles since independence, and how they have mirrored dynamic social, economic, and political changes. And Mayank, I think most of you know him and know his work, so I'm not going to get into the detail. It was also attached in the invite, but he's a graduate of the National Institute of Design, Ahmedabad, and he's curated several shows. He's curated a show for Devi Art Foundation at Khoj. He's been involved with the Planning Commission, and he's worked with the British Council and the Goethe Institute, and written for several well-known magazines. Mike, welcome.
Am I audible? Yeah, is the mic working? Okay. Thank you so much, Mrs. Mehta and the team at the Bhavdaji Art Museum. It's really special to be here. I reciprocate 100 times more the emotion that you've put out for me, the love and the affection. I've long admired your work, and especially in the context of the Bhavdaji Art Museum, being a design museum, I've admired the way it's really transformed the experience of viewership and engagement of historical material in a contemporary context. I'm really, really happy to be here. I know it's such a busy day for Bombay, there's so much going on, so I'm really grateful to all of you to have trekked all the way, to have come. This is the first time in my last 10 years of a professional career in textiles that I'm actually speaking in Bombay, so I'm really, really thrilled. Yeah, it's great. Thanks for being here. I recently returned from Calcutta, where I was involved with a major exhibition on the Balucha textiles from 18th, 19th, and the 20th centuries. Over 3 weeks, we saw close to 800 visitors a day, and I'm told that far exceeds the reception of contemporary art in the city. A publication I guest edited for MARG, Cloth in India, 1947 to 2015, which launched earlier this year, sold out its first print edition of 3,000 copies in the first 6 weeks of its release. This shows that there's a great appetite for contemporary content on textiles as well. This is very encouraging for people like us who've long struggled and found only books and publications and curatorial work on historical textiles, fashion and design in the country. Before I begin my presentation, I think it's very important to share with all of you, and perhaps for the lack of a better word, qualify my own interest in the subject of post-independence histories of textiles, and not just textiles but also design. As we all know, and I hope we can discuss this if there's time, the word design is a very highly contested term both internationally and increasingly in the country. And a further discussion of this is really, really required. In fact, this is going to be the foundation of what I'm teaching over the next 2 days at the Bhavdaji Art Museum for the diploma course, traditional expressions, contemporary expressions in traditional practices, and how design sort of becomes one of the chief agents in resolving issues of what is craft, what is art, and so on and so forth. I went to NID, as Ms. Mehta has earlier shared, as a 17-year-old. Now when I think of it, only ostensibly to study textiles. What mainly actually excited me was, through my 5 years there, the stories of its inception, its journey over the decades. We were lucky that my batch was the last to be taught by some of the earliest teachers of NID who had been there since it started in the early 1960s. Many of them went to the Bauhaus, many of them went to the Ulm School of Design in Germany, many of them actually went to the Basel School of Design and came back and actually developed a curriculum that would mirror the post-war reconstruction through design of Europe and the post-colonial reconstruction of India through design. So we're lucky because a lot of what we received as oral histories and stories and narratives and chats over chai and casual conversations were immense learning. And I suddenly realized that, in a country that's churning out so many designers every year and that has 20 new designers every fashion week, at some point I decided that, India didn't need another designer, but certainly need somebody from my generation who was looking at some of these concerns about textiles and design and fashion more critically. So this is really to explain my sort of sole intent in having, transformed from being a fashion designer who ran a big business in fashion to, over the last 5-6 years, get involved in more sort of critical issues about theorizing design and textiles in the country. Perhaps also it is not entirely incidental that we find ourselves today in a museum that concerns itself with design. The kind of decorative and ornamental arts that are associated with the collections here would, from today's point of view, be termed as design. Indeed, the colonial art colleges that came up in India during the British rule involved themselves with practices such as wooden carving, furniture, lifestyle products, and ceramics, all taught as art. We must therefore think of the very notions of histories that we try and study themselves as changing with dynamic definitions and implications. The work that we see here is by a South African artist friend, Andrew Ananda, and was developed earlier this year at Khoj, an artist in residence space in Delhi that some of you may be familiar with. Situated in the heart of the African migrant community in Delhi, it used textiles, one of the oldest forms of trade between the Indian subcontinent and Africa, as a medium to respond to recent incidents of violence against Africans by local Delhi residents. In what can only be termed as racist attacks, were intrinsic notions of those who qualify as the outsiders and insiders within the geographical area where Khoj is located, and further brought up ideas of caste discrimination within the local Indian communities here as well. Caste is supposed to be dead in independent India. Yet it was such caste-based and community identities that informed textiles and their own usages in a more traditional India. As we see in the next few slides, we know of these through many of the company paintings that were commissioned by the British administrators in colonial India. So we actually see how textiles and their usages in worn garments actually defined and played a very, very important role in maintaining caste, community, clan, religious, professional identities, and so on and so forth. It was therefore revolutionary when Gandhi came up with the idea of very ascetic khadi, because it challenged not only the foundations of the economics of colonialism, but also the divisions that were maintained in Indian society through identities of caste, class, and community, and which were codified, as I mentioned earlier, through worn textiles and clothing. So from today's point of view, suddenly we look at khadi as really, really powerful and a very, very tectonic shift, because you're looking at a country and a tradition of clothing and engaging culturally, where the markers on your skin, the markers of jewelry, the markers of clothes, the markers of textiles, all identify who you are and where you belong in terms of geography, in terms of family, and so on and so forth. And here comes Gandhi saying, some of these have actually led to the problems in the Indian subcontinent, so why don't we erase this idea of what makes us different towards a common idea of what a nationalist sort of project could be. Today, when we see what I earlier showed, in stark contrast, a bulk of the Indian market in fashion and textiles being led by entirely opposing material values of over-ostentation and decoration, we must ask what makes us not only imitate the aesthetic values of the former so-called upper castes and classes that such clothing is associated with, but makes us exaggerate them to maximalist proportions, as is evident in the hugely successful bridal and occasional wear market currently. So it's interesting to see that not only are we mimicking, museum collections of textiles, heavy embroideries, but we're actually taking it to a completely different level. A very interesting anecdote shared by Marthan Singh, who's one of my gurus in textiles earlier this year, was that, today when we look at all of these beautiful Zardozi lehengas which belong to the Nizams and the Awadh families, we fail to remember that actually these textiles were always received through a parda. So you had these extraordinary sculptural embroideries, but then you had a parda, and you received them through the parda, and therefore there was an element of restraint which we've forgotten. We've actually completely removed that historical context, and we've taken it today to a completely different level where it's lost all of that. My presentation is divided into two broad sections. The first concerns itself with raising questions about the very histories of textiles that we attempt to know more about, and the second, which presents a chronological arc. This has been further and in a more detailed manner captured by 8 important authors and 4 interviews in the MARG publication that I earlier spoke about. I must admit that the broad arc that I present is in no way authoritative nor comprehensive, and cannot be, of course, given the diversity of textiles in the country. The images and markers that I use are merely to provoke a way to make connections in Indian textiles across time periods, and to try and suggest the nature of innovation and change that we have seen in the last 7 decades of India's journey as a modern nation. I find it useful to begin by talking about an exhibition called the Textile and Ornamental Arts of India, which was presented at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1955. Designed by American designer Charles Eames, this is the cover of the catalogue, which carried an essay by Indian cultural Zarina Pupul Jaikar. Incidentally, that's when they met. That led to the India report, which led to the setting up of NID. Here's a picture of one part of the exhibition. What is curious, however, is that this exhibition was reciprocated by another exhibition on American design soon after, which was held in Delhi. We have to remember this was the height of anti-British sentiment in India, and America was very, very keen to capitalize on that, and was pushing huge projects between India and America of cultural diplomacy. So we had shows from India that went, like the Ornamental Arts and Textiles of India, which were reciprocated by this show on American design. That entire collection actually now is at the NID, which is, I don't know when was the last time it was shown, but basically formed the foundation of our own curriculum. The show was held in Delhi and was reportedly received hundreds of thousands, if not at least 1 million visitors. The divide between Indian craft and ornamental arts and West-centric design was established. So we're not sending a show of Indian design in which textiles and the former ornamental arts are included. We're sending a show of ornamental arts which is reciprocated by American design. So it's the kind of division, is the kind of fracture that I think we've still not recovered from, because India continues to be seen in terms of the decorative, India continues to be seen in terms of craft, and craft which is production, craft which is not conceptual. India continues not to be seen as something, as a country or as a creative zone of manufacture that produces design, innovative design. It continues to be seen in this binary of what is design and what is craft-based production. So really trying to draw, in my view, what were the beginnings of that kind of discourse, which we're really now struggling to recover from. The former colonized could not suggest its own creative manufacturer's design, which began to be increasingly offered as something that emerges from an industrialized mode of production in an American and European post-war context. So design is post-industrial. It comes from that kind of a mode of production. This divide continues, with countries such as India being seen, like I said earlier, only capable of manufacture and not design. My next few slides aim at sharing with you some of the efforts in India to curate Indian textiles and through them their histories. I feel this is necessary to establish that there are multiple ways of looking at a subject, such as textiles in India. This image is of the Calico Museum of Textiles in Ahmedabad. It is the finest museum and collection of Indian historical textiles in the world. In its comprehensive collections was seen a design resource not only for the calico mills that was run by the same family that started the museum, the Sarabhais, but also for the National Institute of Design, also started by them. Textile design pedagogy, therefore, evolved to draw from Indian historical textiles and to contemporize such traditional designs for new markets. So up till I went to NID, which was 2001, and up till I believe 5 or 6 years back, our curriculum was still focused on studying the collections at the Calico Museum, where we had to learn how to replicate historical Indian textiles and then start really reading into them, start understanding how to contemporize them. So it's very interesting that the finest museum of such textiles in the country emerges to actually provide that kind of educational background, as we see, for instance, the RCA College benefiting from the V&A collection and so on and so forth in the UK. In its experience, it also suggested an Indian way of seeing objects. Dashrath Patel, who was NID's founding director, worked very closely with Gira and Gautam Sarabhai, who were the NID and Calico Museum's founders. It has been pointed out that in India we're not used to look at objects in isolations as European museums do. In bazaars, for instance, we see several vendors selling the same product. So you would have seen those lines of 20 vendors that are selling the same oranges. As a consumer, our eyes get used to picking out the best. We have an uncomfort with negative spaces and like to see masses of material. We like to see things when they're in huge, huge numbers. This is what guided the Calico Museum's display fundamentally, where hundreds of similar textiles are massed together. I don't know how many of you have seen the museum, but if you enter a gallery like this, and let's say, like for instance, the Mughal tent gallery, you don't see conventionally in a museum outside of the country, you would see a beautiful sacred textile with a sort of spotlight. But here what they've done is they've actually masked textiles. So what you get is a true experience of what that textile tradition is, because you begin to see there are hundreds of tents in the Mughal repertoire. They all have something similar and yet they are different. So you begin to actually start training your eyes to see what are the similarities and differences. And I think, therefore, it's really, really not been discussed enough, because Calico Museum has, over the years, become a very, very sort of insular-looking collection and a museum and a foundation. But it's very important to remember that actually India has sort of suggested these unique, these authentic, for the lack of a better word, ways of creating experiences for museums that have countered, even though not in a sort of campaigning sort of manner or in a six-fingerish manner, but in a very kind of proactive manner, how the notion of the Western museum and notions of Western curation were brought to India in the first place. In this Mughal tent room, for example, we see panels together bringing alive how they must have actually been used. Similar tent panels, when we see in museums outside of the country, like I said, are individually placed, and they become artworks in themselves. And we fail to see that actually, this is how a person inside the museum would have actually experienced it. And I think that's really, really important. In the museum, under the leadership of Jyotindra Jain, was another experiment in countering Western notions of what a museum can be for textiles, of course for craft. Drawing from Calico Museum in many ways in its interior galleries, as you can see, this further simulated the physical environments in which crafts that were to be displayed were being made across the country. So this was again extremely path-breaking because it was a very conscious decision to say, you know what, it would be great. I mean, it has an amazing collection. It is perhaps the second best government collection in the country of historical textiles. But instead of actually, you know, sort of making it so structured, the idea was to, along with the historical collections, also simulate the environments in which many of those living traditions actually were made. The building, the whole space, of course, as some of you may know, was designed by Charles Correa. This is often in stark contrast to the way in which exhibitions and curatorial work outside of India continues to engage with the showcase and understanding of Indian textiles. Such work continues to exoticize both historical Indian textiles as well as our contemporary expressions in ways that do not challenge stereotypes about the country or of the region of the subcontinent. This image here is of an exhibition last year at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, curated by its in-house curators of the South Asia section. It was a hugely publicized show called The Fabric of India. It must be asked how different are these engagements with the great exhibitions of Paris and London from the late 19th century, which were aimed at showcasing excellence in handcraftsmanship by imperial powers from their colonies. This image is from an American museum. How has the image of India changed in more than 100 years, where India continues to be the land of modern Maharajas, lavish weddings, and elephants? From such museums in the West today, exhibitions on Indian textiles are being held within the country. This is an image of the Devi Art Foundation in Gurgaon, where I co-curated a show on the subject. We will be discussing a few works from this show a little later, but I want to bring the idea of such spaces here and how their own contexts can influence the imaging and engagement with Indian textiles. Closer home in Bombay, retail stores such as Bungalow 8 has played with the idea of a commercial space transforming into a museum-like environment, referencing the past, as we see here, or as a super contemporary space suggesting an atmosphere more relatable to our everyday context, as we see here, and yet again transforming into a gallery-like space to showcase contemporary designers attempting excellence in handcrafted textiles, as we see here in the case of the display of textile artist and designer Swati Kalsi's work. Such work changes how India sees itself and its own textile traditions, as is distinct from how the other parts of the world see Indian textiles and how as we've seen earlier. In terms of context of spaces, again, exotifying India. In terms of context of spaces for showcase, the Runaway has provided Indian fashion designers being the chief vehicle today of Indian textiles and handcrafted textiles, provided Indian fashion designers a platform to further define how India likes to see itself, as we see here from the finale show a couple of years back at Lakme Fashion Week. This is Sabyasachi's work, and notice how handcrafted plays such an important role, in this case mimicking the taste of an erstwhile wealthy elite in Bengal from the early 20th century, but in today's context applying primarily to the aspirational tastes of a new rich clientele. From such relatively controlled spaces, we must also consider the context of the Indian bazaar, which continues to have a major role to play in terms of taste and mass consumption. This kind of a bazaar could be anywhere in the country, supplying to another kind of bridal wear consumer and using synthetic fabrics as bases for machine-made craftsmanship that in fact mimics handcrafted textiles from the country. From this perspective, Nehru Place in Delhi, I don't know how many of you have been there, a massive shopping arcade with hundreds of shops catering to export businesses from Delhi is a key marker. It is possible to find almost all kinds of fabrics here, and a section of their supply comes from surplus stock being exported outside of the country. So it's very interesting. What happens is that these shops start selling. So, I mean, you have large printers in the country, you have large weavers, huge establishments, including mills, and they're producing thousands and lakhs of meters for companies outside the country, and a few hundred meters, surplus reject stock sort of gets sold through Nehru Places. I know that there are such bazaars in Bombay as well. So the entire boutique environment in Delhi and the entire sort of designer environment in Delhi starts buying these textiles from them. So it's a very interesting way in which textiles, which are actually originally aimed for another market, start entering the Indian aesthetic space, you know. So I mean, we've seen in India, you know, in Delhi, for instance, in the last 5 years, suddenly digital prints are very, very fashionable. And everybody's wearing salwar kameezes made out of them. And many of those prints are completely illegible to our context. So it's very interesting how that, you know, provides us a way to understand an entire other ecology of how design is manufactured, how textiles are produced, and how they're consumed. Whose history, giving you so many examples, control gallery environments, the high-end fashion space, Nehru Place and the export surplus. Whose history are we then trying to narrate, archive, document? And we must be cognizant of the fact that any attempt for such a history can only be limited from a worldview. In this respect, I must also acknowledge that that my own background of being from the NID and having worked in the professional circles that I have, this history concerns itself largely with the handmade and is ignorant of the equally important histories of the mill sector in India. We all know of the tremendous human costs of labor displacement that took place in the 80s in Gujarat and Maharashtra when mills went belly up and shut down, in some cases overnight. So this is a history that unfortunately one has not been able to engage with. It's very, very important. People have written about this from the point of view of the labor displacement, the human costs. But it's also important to write the history of the mill sector through design. We often, including my own publication for MARG, is focused on the handmade evolution of design across several techniques in the country. But I think it's also important to be aware that none of this works in isolation and that it's constantly engaging with the mill sector as well. And that's a history that needs to also be taken up and to be told from the design point of view. In trying to respond to the question of whose history we were indeed trying to study, I'm going to take you all a little back in history with the example of what is commonly referred to as Kalamkari. It's quite interesting. This is a Kalamkari from our show at the Devi Art Foundation. It was a collaboration between a French artist, Berenice Helena, who's done a lot of work for Hermes, and Srini Ranjan, who's from a family of Kalamkari artists. And what she does is she actually transforms the Kalamkari, which is, you know, a narrative tradition, a mythical narrative tradition of certain kinds of myths in the country. She transforms it into a personal expression, an artistic expression of her journey, of her own coming to India in the first place about 30 years back. And she draws these very interesting parallels between Greek mythology on the left and Hindu mythology. So you have Penelope, who actually weaves, I don't know if you know, but Penelope, who Greek mythology, who actually weaves during the day, and then she unweaves what she's woven during the day at night, because, you know, her husband is at war and he refuses to come. I mean, he's probably dead, and people are asking her to marry somebody else. So what she does is she actually keeps this idea of the continuous fabric alive, and then she draws a parallel to Draupadi on the right and her never-ending sari. So it's a fantastic work, in my view, which adds something to the Kalamkari tradition as we know of. We of course know that the Kalamkari tradition is conventionally received like this: chariots and the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Very, very exquisite forms of even contemporary Kalamkari which have been done over the last 30 and 40 years. But we also know historically that what today we receive as a Hindu tradition also was creating these amazing biblical themes for export. We know in the 80s the same tradition was completely disrobed of its religious context to suggest the Kalamkari as a purely decorative material in the Vishwakarma series of interventions in the 1980s and 90s. Again, government-led huge cultural diplomacy initiatives led by Indira Gandhi and Pupul Jaikar, where often, you know, shows would travel to America, but to 22 cities at a time. And a lot of government and state infrastructure went in actually reviving Indian textiles and contemporizing them. And a single point agenda, their design agenda there was very interesting. It was about actually getting rid of religious themes, and to try and attempt a secular narrative for Indian textiles. This, of course, is linked to Nehruvian ideas, because Nehru felt that, contemporary and modern design could sort of, take us out of this constant referencing to ethnicity and the religious and so on and so forth. Historically, we've also seen the Kalamkaris on the left, which were made for the Iran market. So you have an Islamic tradition of the Kalamkari, which actually goes partly from the Coromandel Coast, the same area which is producing all of these multiple versions of the Kalamkari, from biblical themes to the Islamic, to the Hindu mythological, to the decorative. Of course, very fine examples of the Ramayana narratives. And purely decorative for the British and the Dutch market, as we see in the Trees of Life. So I'm bringing this up because even though this is a little bit of historical sort of, a little bit more historical than what we're trying to address, because we also have a tendency to superimpose contemporary sort of perceptions on on a historical tradition that may not be so. So today we're looking at the Kalamkari as a Hindu tradition because there's a certain brand of politics that is trying to appropriate textiles and textile history. But when you actually look at these textiles, we're looking at them as completely dynamic, multiple, and that's very exciting. I think it's very exciting to know, bringing us to the question of what level of, how many of these sort of changes and expressions we can start qualifying as innovation within the tradition. Bringing the Kalamkari into the 60s, and to just continue with that story, on the right is Nelly Setna. Nelly Setna studied at Cranbrook, and some of you may have known her because she was a tapestry artist. She taught at Sophia in Bombay. And Nelly was actually the first sort of Indian designer who goes to Andhra Pradesh and starts working with Kalamkari. And guess what? Kalamkari was actually a word that was never used before the 1960s. It was actually Nelly Setna who starts using the word Kalamkari. So you have the Kalamkar, and you have the Kalamkar being used in so many different contexts. Somebody who basically uses a kalam and is an artist of the kalam and a painter on textile, and with the kind of skills that he brings with it. But the word Kalamkari itself is not used. And over the last 30 years, about 10 books must have been written on the Kalamkari, suggesting it as a 3,000-year phenomena, suggesting it as this great sort of great tradition of India. And so on and so forth. So it's interesting for us to also, some of these things are important, because when you actually start looking at contemporary histories and you start looking at these markers over the last 60, 70 years, you really realize that actually, we've been sort of sold into believing that a lot of these Indian traditions are sort of 5,000 years old, 6,000 years old, 10,000 years old. Some of them possibly are, we don't have material evidence. But how important these contemporary sort of interventions have been in us inheriting the textile vocabulary, in us inheriting the textile traditions that we can today as designers work with. She wrote several books on the subject as well. To Kalamkari being done on saris today, the Hermes sari, when they launched, 10 lakh rupees, I think they did a limited edition, it was 10 lakh rupees a sari. They were digitally printed on very fine silk. Hermes as a company is known for very, very fine quality printing. And they did a huge campaign again, with the elephant and all of that. But again, taking the Kalamkari as an inspiration. Two more examples of the Hermes sari that were inspired by Kalamkaris. Of course, the Kalamkari now becoming a dupatta because more people are wearing salwar kameezes, becoming a cushion cover. Who is really the agency for change here? Is it Is it the person who is actually going and working with the craftsperson and suggesting a new idea? Is it the craftsperson or the artisan or the artist, the Kalamkari artist himself or herself, who's actually responding to new things that are happening in the environment around him or her? Is it a big luxury brand that comes and gives a certain kind of impetus or a certain visibility to an art form that then draws more people to it? Who are the agencies? What are the agencies of change? And this is something that also we need to sufficiently think about, because in many other fields of art, the agencies for this kind of a change and suggesting notions of innovation, change, and so on and so forth actually become theorists, and we don't really have theorists on textiles. We don't have sufficient number of theorists in the country to actually have a conversation about these issues. Continuing with that narrative, to kind of give you an example of block printing again. These are from the archival images of Goethe, who've been very, very generous in sharing. When we look at a rezai or a dohar or a cushion cover, and we look at something like this, we feel like this is traditional. We feel like it belongs to a certain kind of historical trajectory. It doesn't. These are absolutely original new designs. We don't, in historical block prints, find a banana tree, you know. So it's important to understand that, you know, even though there is a suggestion of a certain aesthetic, these are new designs that are being developed today, that are being produced within the same traditional mode of production, and they're contemporary. You know, they allude to some of these textiles on the left and the right. We see historical block print examples, of course, the tents. Again, to come back to Goethe, these are all, you know, the palm right is a completely new design that we don't find in traditional textiles. Go on to the work of Soma. Again, you know, something like this we take for granted today because, you know, companies like Anokhi, companies like Soma, there's a whole range of companies from Jaipur who started working with block printing in the 80s. Actually, block printing was dead. And they really revived it from scratch. And when we look at something like this, we're actually not looking at a historically traditional design repertoire. We're looking at something that actually was invented in the 1980s, and how much we take that for granted in the first place. Some more examples from Soma's archive. This is the founder of Soma, Andre. So if you look at some of her designs for the block print, they actually begin like that and actually have nothing to do with historical block printing designs in the first place. Some more. And of course to the work of Bridget Singh. I'm bringing these up because we often have a tendency to talk about contemporary as something that breaks from a past. We have this tendency to talk about contemporary in terms of the cutting edge. We have a tendency to talk about the contemporary as something that makes us forget a certain kind of historical trajectory. But in all of these cases, they are a carry forward of the same tradition, and yet they are new. They're completely new designs that belong for some reason to the same trajectory in a way that reminds us of the past and yet, you know, are actually quite novel. So the question is, what is contemporary really? It's something that we need to think about in the context of design and textiles. I know in the context of visual arts it's been fairly debated and spoken about. Going on with this discussion of what is the contemporary, we're looking at an Ajrak from 2015, Ajrak block print in madder and indigo, which is being produced in Kutch today by a small community in Ajrakpur. It's also a legacy of borderless India in a way, because it's the Sindh, Pakistan, contemporary India, this region. But we have very similar examples of block prints from the very same region, which are called the Fostat remains. And they're attributed, the earliest ones are attributed about 1,000 years back. Most of them today have been found in archaeological diggings in Egypt. So we're looking at a super contemporary textile that you can buy off, you know, Paramparik Karigar, or you can buy off Dastakar, or you can buy off a store in Bombay. And you're looking at the same technique, similar design repertoire, which we find in the Fostat remains attributed to Gujarat. Incidentally, these designs we also find in the Alchi roof. So it's very interesting to actually look at how the entire region perhaps was connected through trade. Very, very exciting. When I went to Alchi, I couldn't believe that what I was looking at was actually, in my view, an Ajrak canopy in textile. It was actually completely hand painted. Alchi is in Ladakh, in Kashmir. The same Ajrak print is then transformed into interesting skirts. The same Ajrak tradition, which largely produces for a certain functional product, starts becoming artistic in the way that some of those artisans start expressing as artists and want to make only one-of-a-kind textile work. So we're actually looking at several expressions of a same contemporary tradition. Are we looking at several expressions of a deeply historical tradition? What is the contemporary in the historical here? What is the historical in the contemporary? To extend that into contemporary block prints that are being done not too far from Ajrak, from Ajrakpur in Gujarat and Rajasthan. This is the work of Meeta. She's a Delhi-based block print designer who works in Kaladera in Rajasthan. And I don't know if you've heard of this company called People Tree. They were quite sort of popular in the 80s and 90s. And even when we were in high school 15, 16 years back, it was the place to go to. So how they take up this whole idea of expressing a new kind of visual language. Tigers have been seen in historical textiles. Why do they seem contemporary? Why do they seem new? Few more other expressions of the block printing that is being done. The same designer continues. So I think I'm sharing all of these, the example of block printing, Kalamkari, in this case brocade again, to draw a similar kind of trajectory. This is the work of Play Clan. They did what I thought was a very fun range of Banarasi brocades last year for a company called Ekaya in Banaras, where they actually, Play Clan is a company that usually takes from popular culture. I don't know if they have a store in Bombay, but it's a popular brand. And they take these very quirky popular culture elements and sort of create narrative products talking about these eccentricities, about Indian street life, about India, about the diversity of India. So actually that kind of, so in this case they take classical dance forms and they play around and juxtapose the design elements and layouts in such a very interesting way that it's very quintessentially Play Clan and yet adds something to the Banaras repertoire. Another example of Banaras are the Shikargas. This is the work of scholar and revivalist Rahul Jain. These works were nominated for the Jameel Prize in 2013, and the loom for these were dead over 150 years. So these are actually Mughal brocaded textiles that had been dead, the technology of which had been dead for 150 years. And what he does is not only revives the loom over 5 years, right from scratch, but what he also does is he subverts it. So these are sort of a range of textiles, a genre of brocaded textiles from Banaras which are called the Shikarga. And they usually showed the emperor or the king hunting and scenes of, tigers and lions hunting weaker animals. And it's a common sort of theme that you find in painting and other forms of art as well during that period. This is the Mughal period, the late Mughal period when they really, really flourish. And what he does is he actually, instead of the hunted animals, he actually introduces the hunting animals and the hunted animals. He introduces endangered species that, from India. So it's very interesting because he subverts the entire narrative. So you have technically a complete reproduction and revival of an extinct traditional sort of weaving system, but where the narrative is completely subverted. Contemporary or traditional? A little detail if you can see. Another, the snow leopard. Within Banaras, Manish Arora I'm sure all of you have some notion of what a Banarasi sari is, what a traditional Banaras textile is, and therefore I'm showing these as a way to kind of understand whether we would see this as part of another culture that is taking from Banaras, or do we see it as part of a culture that's actually giving to the Banaras tradition. More questions than answers, but I hope this is exciting. Manish Arora, who worked with Banaras weavers to do some really interesting, tiger prints, animal prints, very, very optic, pop art inspired designs. On the left, you see he did this whole collection on inspired by playing cards. On the right, very, very graphic. Again, Manish Arora for Banaras brocades. And then, just when you sort of start looking at these sort of interesting motifs and ideas in the Banaras tradition as something which is 21st century, you're taken back to Banaras brocades from the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, when not only were they taking from European influences like Art Nouveau and Art Deco, but they were also at the same time. So you have this very interesting mix where you're actually taking all of these designs and motifs that actually belong to the European brocading and textile tradition. But you also insert nationalist messages. So as you can see, this actually has a flag of India, the Ashoka pillar, the Ashoka sort of wheel, which later then of course becomes the symbol for independent India. Here you have the undivided India being shown, and these are textiles from the 20s and 30s and 40s. So the same ability, you see the same ability in the Banaras tradition to actually to improvise, to engage with a larger world, to take parts of it that they find aesthetically pleasing perhaps, but also insert messages that are deeply political. Or in this case, where again you see the Indian flag. Now, these kinds of brocades we would conventionally sort of associate with a certain kind of elite patronage in India that we find because, the Maharani of Indore, a lot of the Maharanis from the 20s to the 40s were actually, commissioning brocade saris from Banaras that were very, very European inspired. In some cases, they were actually adding on borders, that were coming from Europe to Indian fabric and so on and so forth. Just to run through a few more examples. And at the same time, you have the Indian Maharajas who also wear these textiles. These textiles were used to make very interesting achkans. So you're also looking at a tradition which today has been feminized to such an extent that you don't associate it with a certain kind of male wardrobe until this starts happening. So what is Western here? What is European? These huge advertising campaigns which are obviously aimed at the Indian groom, but you use white models to kind of make them popular. So in all of these, what are we really looking at in the Banaras tradition? We're looking at a tradition which is very, very dynamic. We're looking at a tradition which has constantly been renewed. We're looking at a tradition which does not really reject anything. It's a very inclusive kind of tradition, unlike what we're made to believe today, where we're looking at textiles as, or we have an entire sort of brigade of textile purists who feel that certain things should not be done to textiles. We're looking at the very tradition of textiles in a very important region and creative zone as the Banaras handloom industry as being very, very dynamic. Great. I'm going to now quickly run through a broad chronology. I know my presentation so far has not been very chronological. I'm trying to make connections over periods, and I hope that's useful because I think that textiles and textile histories aren't that linear. We're making very, very huge connections. So I try, even though the MARG publication is trying to be linear about what happened in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on and so forth. Largely, I like to sort of look at these, sort of surprising ways in which connections start happening. To run through quickly now, slightly more attempt at being chronological. We all know of Gandhi and we all know of Khadi, how it was used as a very powerful economic, political, cultural tool to fight the colonial British rule. Never before, perhaps, until then, had a single textile created this kind of mass mobilization that we see Khadi doing, and that's really interesting. Very evident from these images that we have of masses of people wearing white. I mean, I don't even know what it might have been like to actually live through these moments where, people forget their own sort of backgrounds and their own community identities, all in favor of something very, very humble, all in favor of something common. But what is interesting and what is lesser known is actually the freedom movement allowed for dissent with Khadi as well. And one of the biggest dissenters of Khadi, and especially white Khadi, was Sarojini Naidu. She refused to wear white Khadi. She felt that it took away from feminine arts of India, it took away from the decorative arts of India, and she actually, along with Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay, used to organize something called the Orange Brigades. So none of the associations we have with orange today, but at that time what they would do is they would dye Khadi, they would decorate it, and they would organize these marches to protest against white Khadi, and they would have huge public arguments with Gandhi. So even when Gandhi goes for the round table conference, there's Sarojini Naidu wearing her beautiful silk and her beautiful gold jewelry, and she refuses to wear white khadi, when of course we know that Gandhi was making a very important statement. I think it's very interesting that a movement like this, which was single-mindedly focused on khadi, also allowed for dissent. Dissent also came from Nehru's wife, Kamla Nehru. She refused to wear khadi. They also felt that if khadi was to become the main source of manufacture in the country, we would lose out on our own sophisticated skills of craft. And that is also something to be remembered. And Gandhi is gone on record to actually be empathetic and appreciate that, even though he was completely championing khadi. Images like these were sent out. So you can only imagine what such an interesting communication, because here she's wearing these beautiful silk and cotton saris with brocading, and she's shown spinning khadi. And images of like these were sent out in hordes to propagate the use of khadi. At the same time, you had the royal and princely families. So you have Princess Durashavur. She was the daughter of the last caliph, an Ottoman princess who marries the sixth Nizam of Hyderabad. And so you can imagine these sort of palaces being these cocooned environments where everybody around these palaces in the gullies are probably wearing khadi. But here she is dressed in a very, very beautifully embroidered sari. It's chiffon, mimicking very famous of Elsa Schiaparelli, who was a designer, and she would use these she was a surrealist, and she was part of the surrealist movement, and it was mimicking. So it's actually, for many years, many of us thought that actually it was a Schiaparelli sari, but it wasn't. It was produced in Bombay. So you have this parallel movement within certain kind of spaces going on, where you have these beautiful saris being made at the same time. I was just recently told about this story. This is Ma Cooch Bihar, Maharani Gayatri Devi's mother. And, she was the first person to actually bring chiffon into the sari. And I was told about this recently by Mayank Singh. Apparently she used to get a lot of her clothes made because she spent a lot of time in London. She actually got married in a pantsuit in London. And she used to, commission clothes by couturiers in Paris. And she found chiffon, which was earlier actually worn as it was an undergarment fabric. She actually started adding these borders to it and started this sort of style of wearing the sari. Just another few examples of the kind of expressions you see in textiles and fashion among royal and princely families. And then, of course, this image, which completely breaks out of all of this, is an extremely westernized Maharani of Indore, whose husband actually commissioned the interiors of his palace, the Maning Bagh Palace in Indore, by a German Vienna school designer. So very interesting, a Bauhaus connection, a first expression of a certain kind of international modernism that we see in India, where you see this, you know, Indian Maharajas did not live like this, they lived in pomp and splendor. And you had the Maharaja of Indore, Yashwant Rao, who commissions the German architect Matthäus, Eckhard Matthäus, from the Vienna school. Very close relationship with the Bauhaus, but not really the Bauhaus school, to commission these interiors of a palace in India. We're talking about the late 1920s and the early 1930s, so this was more than 10 years before Corbusier comes to India. Just as a way of sharing one expression of that kind of modernity within which the kind of textiles and garments we saw earlier would have functioned. Rugs were commissioned in France. Another expression of that kind of modernity comes through the Polish artist Stefan Noblin. I'm not specifically talking about textiles here, but I'm trying to create an environment where some of these European textiles obviously were used. These are drawings of what were to be interiors of the Umaid Bhavan Palace. The Polish artist Stefan Noblin flees Nazi rule in Poland, comes to Bombay via Iraq, and gets commissioned to do the Jodhpur Palace and the Morvi Palace in Bombay and a home in Patna. So this is what he actually draws to be some of the interiors of the Umaid Bhavan Palace. Again, some of these carpets are to be woven by Indian dari makers. But actually what the reality or the execution of that kind of aesthetic becomes this in the Indian context. So you have some elements from what Stefan Noblin suggests, but then you have a certain appropriation of it in the Indian context. Stefan Noblin is then commissioned to paint these huge mythical narratives. You see some of the Indian elements which are brought in. Of course, the throne comes in. So you have the intention of this kind of modernism, but it gets expressed like this. Or you have elements of that kind of super modernist, you know, very true modernist, international modernist kind of aesthetic, but then you see how it gets appropriated with certain kinds of very decorative Indian elements, just to kind of give you another example of how that kind of international modernism comes. And then the third expression of that kind of modernism we see in the work of Le Corbusier. So if you really go to Chandigarh and look at those extraordinarily large-scale works of architecture, actually what, according to me, impresses are really the textiles. Because if you remove these textiles, what do you really have? Of course, I'm a textile designer, so it's my point of view. But what's interesting is that these tapestries, which are made completely in the European tradition of tapestries, India does not have a tradition of tapestries, get actually made in India. So the Panja Dari weavers of Punjab actually are consolidated into workshops in the 50s and 60s to produce these large-scale architectural commissions for Corbusier. Some of them, the smaller ones, are actually made in Paris. Another expression. What is also equally interesting is that Corbusier actually takes some of these symbols from Indian miniature paintings and Indian art and introduces these in his repertoire of design, something we never see before. These are, and we're working on a project currently to actually archive many of these because they've started showing up in auctions and so on and so forth, so we really don't know what's going on with them. And you can see how the government has cut them up to introduce these AC ducts. So what are we really looking at? Are we looking at a tradition of Indian, this eventually, of course, and I don't have the time to go into it, but we're actually trying to draw connections between this entire phase of production of these large-scale tapestries in Punjab to the entire movement of when brands like Shah Mahuja start doing daris in Punjab. There's a big link because you're obviously skilling a very large number of weavers, and that starts sort of and once Corbusier goes and they don't have those commissions, what do those weavers do? So they start sort of doing things on their own, and eventually we have a scenario where contemporary designers like Shah Mahuja actually are able to utilize these skills 20 years, 30 years later to create India's first international brands in textiles. Some more images. Another expression of modernism, and these are the last few slides that I end with. And again, very lesser work done is the work of somebody called Helena Perentupa, who was a Finnish textile designer. Incidentally, she studied at Cranbrook with Nelly Setna, whom we earlier spoke about. And while Nelly sets up the weaving department at the NID, she invites Helena to come in the late 60s to actually run the textile program at NID. So you have a Finnish designer, so you're looking at NID, where graphic design is borrowed from the Basel School of Design, product design and industrial design from Bauhaus and the Ulm School. And in the same kind of aesthetic language, you have Helena Perentupa, who arrives and for almost 20 years runs the textile design program at NID. Her own background is in Marimekko. Marimekko is a Japanese-inspired Finnish textile company which reached its heights actually in the 60s. And these are some of her designs. And then she goes on to define the entire generation of textile designers from NID who draw to a certain kind of minimalist aesthetic. Some more designs. Marimekko still exists. It's a very successful and large company. It has stores all over the world. And I end with this work of Abraham and Thakur because both of them, Rakesh Thakur and David Abraham, both very famous fashion designers and leading sort of commentators on Indian fashion, actually learn from her. They actually study an Indian textile design program from a designer who's completely trained in a Scandinavian aesthetic. So sort of end with this connection that some of these ideas that began in the 60s and 70s in India continue to sort of live on. And a final image that I love usually ending with, because you have the tapestry of Corbusier in the Capitol complex, and you have this image of Gandhi. So what we are receiving today, again in the revival mode that everybody is today in, about how we have to save handlooms. Incidentally, Banaras is only 5% handlooms now, so some of us in the textile field really don't understand what the hue and cry is really about. It's only 5% handlooms, it's 95% in the palooms. But just to kind of place in context that this interest in handloom, which doesn't seem to go, starts with Gandhi in a more sort of recent context. And then you have the other narrative, which is of Nehruvian India and modernism. So you have international modernism, which is extremely minimalist, which tries to erase the religious, which tries to erase the ethnic. And then you have Gandhi, which is also extremely austere, favors a certain kind of minimalism. And both of these are expressed in very, very different ways. And these are the kind of, in my view, two trajectories that we today inherit in textiles and in design. Okay, khatam. Questions? Those who have to run, please run, because I know some of you really have to run. Yeah, please go ahead.
Do you mind?
I don't know what the time situation is, so do we have time for questions? I don't know. Snehal, Pooja?
Yeah.
Do we have time for questions? What time is it?
At 10 minutes. Yeah, we have time.
Okay.
7 minutes.
Okay. So, okay.
I just want to remind repeating Helena's last name.
Perentupa. Perhentupa.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't ask you a question when you were introduced over there, but my question might have little to do with what I was going to tell you, and that is, what is the situation with raw materials for dyes? I'm recently involved in a conservation and weaving project for an exhibit in Lincolnshire in England next spring, and we had a hell of a time trying to find the organic and natural dyes that were traditionally used in Manipur, where I'm from originally, and we were able to find, say, for the pink and black, basically pink and black striped make the sarong like lower garment, we had to go with chemical dyes for the pink, and we were able to, however, find kum, which is the traditional black, kind of deep blue black, almost like an indigo, for the black. So, what is the situation for natural and organic dyes traditions of India at this point?
It's been reduced to a very, very small artisanal level of production. So I'm not familiar with the states in the northeast, but I myself have seen that, I mean, you might be familiar that Dasakar Andhra in Hyderabad is doing some work, and they were sort of pioneers in reviving natural dyeing in the 80s when it was dying. Kalakshetra was doing some work. I don't think they've continued the natural dyeing program anymore. Rajasthan, we've seen a new revival of some of these. In Gujarat, what is being termed, in my view, as purely organic and natural dyeing is actually not is not purely natural. So it's actually been reduced to a very small sort of zone of production, and therefore we need to qualify and question when a lot of Indian designers, in the garb of appearing sustainable or organic or fair trade and so on and so forth, because it becomes such a fashionable thing, we need to actually go back to these sources, because actually we don't have certification standards. So because we don't have certification standards, we really can't say. Orissa, I was there 6 or 7 years back, and in Kotpad, you saw that they're still able to do those 8 shades of red that they were traditionally known for. But it's been reduced to a very, very small sphere. What is interesting is that in the last 4 or 5 years, I've come across, I think, 2 companies. One is based in Ahmedabad and one in Bombay, and I forget what they're called, that actually are doing natural dyeing, but in completely doing color fast natural dyes, but in non-artisanal setups. So they're actually, they've taken it to an industrial level, where they're able to dye in huge quantities and they're able to get many, many shades, but it's not, it's a completely industrial setup using natural dyes. Avni is an example. I don't know if you know about Avni in Uttaranchal, in upper Uttaranchal, that is doing a lot of work in natural dyeing. But we have no certification standards for organic. We don't have an agreed upon certification system. So in the lack of that, it becomes very difficult to qualify and test any of these things, But it's been reduced to a very small artisanal zone of production now. Yeah.
I mean, a very follow-up question. If there is no certification process, how do Indian exporters overcome or meet the standards that are fairly stringent in the EU, for instance? I mean, the United States is a little less so, but I know that from my experience, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later. But how do they develop the markets abroad if they are not able to provide levels of certification?
So so I'm talking about Indian certification systems. So there are certain exporters, for instance, in Kutch that are producing organic cotton, and there are mills now that are producing organic cotton. But these certifications are from the Dutch standards, the Dutch organization where there's certain, you have to keep the land untilled for 7 years, and so they actually, some of these big companies that take that kind of export seriously have adhered to those international systems. I think Punjab is now producing organic cotton, which also meets certain kinds of international standards of what is organic cotton. But other than that, I don't know. I know in Andhra Pradesh where they produce Desi Cotton, and it's the only region in the country now which is hand spinning cotton. So it's true khadi. And they're growing a very, very traditional variety of cotton called Desi Cotton. So just to give you a background, you may know about this a little more, but traditionally khadi was done from short staple cotton, and that kind of production of cotton was killed during the colonial rule because cotton from India had to be exported for the mills of Manchester and the UK. So you needed long staple cotton, because short staple cotton is only good for hand spinning, it's not good for machine spinning. So that changed, but now there's a revival, I think, in Andhra Pradesh. Malka, the Malka project in Andhra Pradesh is trying to do that, where you have no international certifications, but it's been growing, cotton is being grown in a completely local way, you know, crop rotation and things like that, but it doesn't meet international standards. But those companies in India that are very keen on meeting those international standards actually adhere to the Amsterdam certification system.
Bit of home hand spinning in Manipur still.
Yeah.
Not in the cottage industry now.
Okay, I think, yeah? Sure.
Lecture, man. And I'm just curious, maybe taking from this gentleman's point, that I'm really curious to know what's happening in the Northeast, because nobody really talks about the textile tradition there. I mean, it's usually lumped into this one Northeast, but I mean, each state has really distinct textiles and hand woven. So I'm just curious to know, I mean, is there any sort of, not just research, but I mean, any kind of archiving happening, or, I mean, this idea that you explained about tradition and then kind of converting into traditional, into more contemporary sort of a design. So is anybody really kind of looking into this? Would you be able to share a little bit? Because, it's great to know about Banarasi and Kalamkari and all, but, to really, sort of, if you can share something just off the...
Yeah, you're quite right. I mean, I've tried to share what fairly sort of mainstream sort of textile techniques, and of course one can go on about it. I'm not that familiar with what's happening in the Northeast, but I mean there are certain increasingly non-governmental organizations. I think ANT is one, the Chizami Weave project in Nagaland is one. There are some efforts now to revive the traditional designs that are being increasingly lost. We have to understand that many of these techniques, as far as I know, actually developed within systems where they were consumed by the makers. So to shift that into a system where you're making it for not yourself is a tectonic shift. And with the result that when I was in Kohima last, a lady looked at me, a very old lady, a very beautiful lady, and she said, "You're a leaping frog." And I don't know, and I don't know what that meant, but it's a motif and it means something, So each of these things has a certain kind of meaning for the maker and for the community. Now to take that into a cushion cover, to take that, is that contemporizing? We don't know. Recently I've come across 2 or 3 designers who now work in Delhi from Nagaland, and they're doing interesting things. There have been some work in Eri and Muga, which are traditional, non-mulberry silks. So there's been some work being done. So I think there is work happening in small pockets, but the last major exercise in archiving textiles from the Northeast, as far as I know, was undertaken by the IGNCA, the Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts, along with the NID. And this was a project that was started, I think, 10 years back, and I think it was the last major, or perhaps the only major comprehensive documentation that I know of that was done. And finally, some of the people who led that project, my professors at NID, shared with us is actually very little cotton, and that most of it is completely, I mean, you may know more about this, but they came to the result that very little cotton was actually being used, and most of it was now synthetic. But there are 7 books that, because now of the politics of cultural organizations and change in government, are not being released. But there was a major show and conference 3 years back where they showed these 7 publications and did a major show. So I don't really know whether there's a follow-up or when we'll actually publicly see the results of that kind of documentation. We don't know. The person who did the Kalamkari, the Berenice Helena, who's a French artist, she tried to work with a private collector, father and son, in Kohima, to create a museum which was going to be public-private partnership of their collection, which is like some 6,000 works, including textiles. We also have to remember that these regions are also very westernized. music in contemporary, I mean, very fashionable regions that are looking at other parts of the world and not towards mainland India for inspiration, for engagement and so on and so forth. So I think it's a region that's very, very dynamic. Projects have been offered to me and I'm very uncomfortable taking them on. And that's why I qualified at the beginning that, it's often easier to tell your own story. It's easier for me being in Delhi to talk about the things that I see. I find it very uncomfortable when I'm invited to the northeast regions and asked to suggest ideas for new designs, because I'm like, I don't understand this vocabulary, and how do you start engaging with it? But that's my point of view. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we can all go.